The council's torches cut through the blizzard like dying stars. Margaret's knees hit frozen ground, not in submission, but because the guards forced her down. Her newborn son wailed against her chest, the sound swallowed by howling wind. Defective. Thomas's voice carried no warmth. The alpha stood above her, his shadow blocking what little moonlight remained. The spine is twisted. The lungs are weak. The law is clear. Margaret's fingers tightened around the infant. Blood still stained her thighs from the birth. She delivered him 3 hours ago. 3 hours of being Luna. 3 hours of believing Thomas would hold their son with pride instead of disgust. He's your son.
He was.
Thomas turned to the council, his back to her now as if she'd already ceased to exist. Strip her title. Cast them both to the culling field. Tonight. The pack gasped. No one had ever seen an alpha reject his own mate, his own Luna. Robert, Thomas's brother, stepped forward from the circle of elders, his face twisted in disbelief. Brother, this is... Silent. Thomas didn't even look at him. His eyes found Joan, a young Omega trembling at the edge of the circle. She'd been carrying firewood when the council convened. Now the logs lay scattered at her feet.
You.
Come here. Joan's legs barely held her as she stumbled forward. Thomas seized her wrist, yanking her close enough that Margaret could see the terror in the girl's eyes. She was 19, maybe 20. Margaret had taught her to read last winter. You are my mate now. You will give me an heir worthy of this pack. Margaret's laugh was sharp enough to cut. It ripped from her throat before she could stop it, raw and jagged and wrong. You'll have nothing. Thomas struck her. The blow snapped her head sideways, blood bright against snow. Her son's wail spiked in pitch, a sound like breaking glass. The metallic taste flooded her mouth.
Take her. Take the thing.
Before dawn breaks, I want them frozen. The guards dragged Margaret backward. Her heels carved trenches through snow as she fought to keep her son pressed against her chest. His cries grew weaker with each passing second. The pack watched in silence as their Luna, stripped, humiliated, condemned, was hauled toward the northern gates with a dying child in her arms. Some looked away. Others wept. None moved. The gates slammed shut. The sound echoed like a death knell. Thomas turned his back. His hand remained locked around Joan's wrist as he walked toward the council hall, pulling the trembling Omega behind him. The torches followed. One by one, they disappeared into the warmth, leaving Margaret alone in the killing cold. She could hear her son struggling to breathe. Each inhale rattled. Each exhale came slower than the last. The healers had been right about his lungs. They were too small, too weak. The cold would finish what his body couldn't survive on its own. Margaret pressed her lips to his forehead. His skin burned despite the blizzard.
Fever.
Already. She dug her nails into frozen earth. The ground resisted, hard as iron. She tore bark from trees with her teeth, her jaw screaming in protest. Blood filled her mouth, hers, not his. She wrapped her son in strips of her own cloak, sacrificing warmth she didn't have to spare. When he whimpered from hunger, she bit into her palm until blood welled up, then pressed it to his lips.
He drank. Barely.
But he drank. You will live, she whispered into his ear as the first light of dawn bled across the horizon. The sky turned from black to gray to pale gold. The blizzard had stopped. The world was silent. Beautiful.
Deadly.
And when you are strong, we will return, not to beg. Her son's eyes opened. For the first time since birth, they opened fully, and they were silver. Not blue, like hers. Not amber, like Thomas's. Silver as moonlight, silver as starfire, silver as something old and furious and waiting. Margaret's breath caught. She'd heard stories. Legends her grandmother whispered when the elders weren't listening. Bloodlines the pack tried to erase. Her son looked at her. Through her. Into her. To conquer, she whispered. And in the distance, beyond the trees, the pack howled their morning song. They celebrated their new Luna, their new future, their new perfect heir. They had no idea what they'd just created in the snow. Margaret was the perfect Luna. For 10 years, she stood beside Thomas as his equal, his partner, the beating heart of the Frostvale Pack. She mediated disputes when border tensions flared between rival families. She healed the wounded after hunts gone wrong, her hands steady even when others looked away. She taught the young to read, to track, to understand that strength wasn't only measured in teeth and claws. The pack loved her. They brought her gifts during festivals. They sought her counsel when Thomas grew too harsh. They called her their heart. Thomas didn't. He needed an heir, a son strong enough to hold the Alpha's throne when age or challengers came for him. Margaret gave him one. But the boy was born with a twisted spine, ribs that barely held his lungs, a body the healers declared incompatible with survival. They'd whispered it while she was still bleeding from the birth, their voices low but not low enough. Thomas had heard. He'd nodded once. Then he'd called the council. Thomas didn't hesitate. The law demanded culling, and Thomas was the law. But here's what broke Margaret's world. Thomas didn't just follow tradition. He used it. She'd seen the relief in his eyes when the healers delivered their verdict. She'd seen him calculate. He'd been searching for an excuse to discard her for years. She knew that now. The defective pup was his golden opportunity. In one brutal night, he sentenced their son to death, stripped Margaret of her title as Luna, cast her out alongside the infant, claimed Joan as his new mate, and declared Joan would give him the perfect heir Margaret failed to produce. The pack stood frozen in shock. This wasn't justice. This was annihilation. Margaret's only crime? Giving birth to a child Thomas deemed unworthy. But Margaret's son wasn't defective. The twisted spine, the weak lungs, the silver eyes that glowed in darkness. These weren't flaws. They were symptoms of something the pack tried to erase from history, the Silver Claw bloodline. Born once every 3 generations, Silver Claws were wolves who didn't submit to alphas. They challenged them. They grew faster, fought harder, carried markings that pulsed with ancient power. Margaret's grandmother had told her the stories in whispers, late at night when the elders couldn't hear. Margaret had thought they were myths, until her son opened his eyes. Thomas didn't know what he'd just condemned to the snow. But Margaret was beginning to understand. The son didn't die. Within weeks, his spine straightened. Margaret watched it happen in the firelight of their crude shelter, her hands pressed to his back as bone shifted beneath skin. His lungs strengthened. His breathing deepened. The silver marks beneath his skin began to glow under the full moon, faint at first, then brighter, spreading like veins of light across his shoulders. Margaret named him Edward, after her father. Thomas had forbidden that name during her pregnancy. Edward Sr. was the last known Silverclaw, killed by Thomas's own father in a challenge 30 years ago. Margaret was raising the one thing that could destroy Thomas, a living weapon forged from his own blood. Meanwhile, something else was unfolding in the pack. Joan, the Omega Thomas forced into becoming his mate, was barren. Not naturally. Cursed. The act of taking another's mate while that bond still lived had triggered an ancient consequence the pack had forgotten. A stolen bond bears no fruit. Thomas would have no heir. His line ended with him. And when the pack discovered this 3 years later, when Joan's belly remained flat month after month despite Thomas's demands, his authority began to fracture. Margaret and Edward thrived in the forbidden northern woods. She taught him to hunt, to fight, to survive without a pack's protection. He was faster than any wolf his age should be. Stronger. His silver eyes saw in complete darkness. The silver claw markings now covered his shoulders like armor, glowing faint blue when he ran, bright white when he fought. She told him stories every night. Stories of his grandfather. Stories of silver claws who refused to bow. Stories of what Thomas had taken from them. And Edward listened. He remembered. He waited. because Margaret had made him a promise in the snow, and she intended to keep it. They would return, not to beg, to conquer. The guards threw Margaret into the culling field like she was already a corpse. Her knees hit frozen ground hard enough to crack bone. She didn't feel it. The only thing she felt was her son's heartbeat against her chest, too fast, too weak, fading with every breath. Behind her, the gates slammed shut. The sound was final, absolute. She was outside the pack now, outside protection, outside mercy. The culling field stretched before her in endless white, a wasteland where the weak were sent to die quietly so the strong wouldn't have to watch. Thomas's voice still echoed in her skull. Defective.
Thing.
Not worthy. She'd been Luna for 10 years. 10 years of standing beside him, speaking for him, bleeding for him. She'd negotiated peace treaties with rival packs while pregnant with his child. She'd held the pack together through 2 brutal winters when game was scarce and tempers flared. She'd taught the young, healed the wounded, mediated disputes that would have torn them apart. And he discarded her in minutes. The memory hit her like a blade. 3 hours ago, she'd been in the birthing chamber. The healers had pulled her son free, and for one perfect moment, she'd seen Thomas's face soften. He'd stepped forward, reached out. Then the head healer had turned the infant over, and the room went silent. The spine, the ribs, the labored breathing. Thomas's expression had shuddered like a door slamming closed. He'd called the council immediately. Margaret's fingers tightened around her son. He was so small, so fragile. His skin burned with fever despite the cold. She could feel his ribs through the thin cloth she'd wrapped him in, ribs that didn't sit right, that pressed against his lungs with every shallow breath. The blizzard had stopped. The sky was lightening. Dawn would break soon, and with it, the cold would finish what Thomas had started. She looked down at the culling field. The snow was pristine, untouched. She was the first wolf in years to be thrown here while still breathing. Most were dragged out after death, a formality to satisfy the old laws. But Thomas wanted her to suffer. He wanted her to watch her son die first, then freeze alone with the knowledge that she'd failed. Margaret dug her nails into the frozen earth. The ground resisted. She tore harder. Her nails split. Blood welled up, bright red against white snow.
She didn't stop.
She clawed until her fingers found tree bark, then ripped strips free with her teeth. The bark cut her mouth. She didn't care. She wrapped her son in everything she could find: bark, cloth torn from her own dress, her cloak shredded into pieces. He whimpered. The sound was so quiet she almost missed it. "No," she whispered. "No, you don't get to leave me." She bit into her palm. Blood pooled in her hand. She pressed it to his lips. He didn't drink it first. His mouth stayed slack. Then his tongue moved.
Once. Twice.
He swallowed. Margaret's breath caught. She pressed her bleeding hand closer. He drank again. The sky turned gold. Dawn broke over the culling field, painting the snow in shades of amber and rose. Beautiful.
Deadly.
Margaret held her son against her chest and felt his heartbeat strengthen. Just a fraction. Just enough. His eyes opened. Silver. Not blue. Not amber. Silver like starlight, like something ancient and furious and waiting. Margaret stared. She knew what silver eyes meant. Her grandmother had told her the stories: silver claws, the bloodline the pack tried to erase, wolves who grew faster and fought harder and refused to bow. Thomas had just thrown away the one thing that could destroy him. Margaret's lips pulled back in something that wasn't quite a smile. She pressed her forehead to her son's. Her voice was raw, broken, absolute. "You will live, and when you are strong, we will return, not to beg." Her son's silver eyes locked onto hers. To conquer. Margaret built shelter with her bare hands and teeth. The northern woods loomed around her like a wall of shadows, ancient pines so thick they choked out the moonlight. She dragged fallen branches into a crude lean-to, her muscles screaming with exhaustion. Blood crusted under her nails. Her dress hung in shreds. She didn't stop. Her son lay wrapped in the remains of her cloak, his breathing shallow but steady. She'd named him Edward in her mind, after her father, after the name Thomas forbade. Every time she looked at him, rage bloomed fresh in her chest. Not grief. Not despair.
Rage.
It burned hotter than any fire, and she fed it with every broken branch, every stripped piece of bark, every moment Thomas thought she'd be dead by now. She pressed Edward against her chest, skin to skin, sharing what little warmth her body could spare. His fever had dropped. Not by much, but enough. His heartbeat no longer stuttered. She counted each pulse like a prayer. The woods were wrong. She'd known it the moment the guards threw her beyond the gates, but now, in the dark, she felt it in her bones. The air tasted different here, older, thicker, like breathing in history. The trees stood too straight, too still. No wind moved through them, yet she heard whispers. Not words, just the suggestion of sound, like voices speaking in a language she'd forgotten. Something watched her. She couldn't see it, couldn't smell it, but she felt its attention like weight pressing against her skull. Margaret bared her teeth at the darkness. "Come closer," she whispered. "See what happens." Nothing moved, but the feeling didn't fade. She turned her attention back to Edward. His skin was too hot again. She unwrapped him carefully, checking for infection, for wounds, for anything that might explain why his body kept burning. Her hands stilled.
His spine.
The twisted curve that had condemned him. It was different. Straighter. She pressed her fingers along the line of his back, feeling vertebrae that sat wrong just hours ago now shifting into alignment.
Impossible.
Bones didn't heal overnight. Bones didn't reshape themselves. Edward's eyes opened. Silver. They glowed faint in the darkness, 2 points of cold light in a face too small to carry such intensity. He looked at her. Through her. Into her. Margaret's breath caught. She'd seen eyes like that once before, in a portrait her grandmother kept hidden. Eyes that belonged to someone the pack didn't speak about anymore. "What are you?" Margaret whispered. Edward didn't answer. He couldn't. He was hours old, but his eyes tracked her movements with awareness no infant should possess. Margaret pulled him close again. Her mind raced. The stories her grandmother told, she thought they were legends meant to scare children into obedience. Silver claws. Wolves born with power that didn't submit to hierarchy, didn't bend to alphas. Her grandmother had claimed Margaret's bloodline carried it, dormant, waiting for the right generation. Margaret had dismissed it. She'd been practical, focused. She'd married Thomas and become Luna through competence, not magic. But Edward's eyes said otherwise. The night deepened. Margaret dozed in fits, her body too exhausted to fight sleep, her mind too wired to surrender. Every time she woke, she checked Edward's breathing.
His spine. His eyes.
Each time, he seemed stronger. The curve of his back flattened further. His breathing came easier. The silver glow in his eyes brightened. At some point near dawn, Margaret rose. Edward slept against her chest, wrapped tight. She needed water.
Food.
Something to keep them alive past the next day. The northern woods were forbidden, but they were also full of game. The pack never hunted here, which meant prey ran thick. She moved deeper into the trees, stepping carefully over roots that seemed to shift beneath her feet. The wrongness intensified. Magic. That's what this was. Old magic, the kind the pack elders warned against, the kind that demanded prices no one wanted to pay. Margaret stopped. A tree ahead of her was carved. Deep grooves cut into ancient bark, symbols she didn't recognize but somehow knew. Her eyes traced the patterns, spirals within circles, lines that crossed and recrossed, shapes that hurt to look at directly. They glowed faint silver in the pre-dawn light. Silver. Like Edward's eyes. Margaret stepped closer. Her heart hammered. The symbols weren't random. They formed patterns. Words, maybe. Or warnings. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the carved bark. The moment she touched it, heat rushed up her arm. Not painful.
Familiar.
Like touching something that had always belonged to her. Edward stirred against her chest. His hand, tiny, impossibly fragile, pressed against her collarbone. His skin glowed. Faint silver marks appeared beneath the surface, tracing lines along his shoulders, his arms, his spine. The same patterns as the tree. Margaret's breath stopped. The wind changed. It carried a whisper, barely audible, barely there, but undeniable. A single word that sounded like wine through leaves, like water over stone, like something ancient waking after a long sleep. Silver claw.
Margaret spoon.
Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. Just the feeling of being watched by something that didn't have eyes. She looked down at Edward. His silver marks pulsed in time with his heartbeat. His eyes opened again, glowing brighter now.
Aware.
Waiting. Margaret didn't know what Silverclaw meant. Not fully. But she knew Thomas had tried to kill it. Tried to bury it in snow and let the cold finish what fear started. He'd failed. Whatever Edward was becoming, whatever she was raising in these forbidden woods, Thomas should have made sure it stayed dead. Because Margaret would make certain he regretted letting it live. Thomas stood in the council hall and watched his authority crumble. 3 months since he'd thrown Margaret into the culling field. 3 months, and the pack still whispered her name like a prayer. They mourned her. Openly. Some wore strips of white cloth tied around their wrists, the traditional sign of grief for a fallen Luna. Thomas had ordered them to stop. They hadn't. Half the pack refused to acknowledge Joan. She sat beside him during council meetings, small and silent and trembling, her hands folded in her lap like a child waiting for punishment. She was 19. Thomas had chosen her because she was young, fertile, and too terrified to refuse. He'd needed an heir. Fast. Before the pack started questioning whether an alpha who killed his own son deserved to rule. But Joan wasn't giving him an heir. The head healer stood before the council now, her face carefully blank. She'd examined Joan that morning. Thomas had demanded it after 2 months of Joan's belly remaining flat despite his efforts. The healer's silence stretched too long. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Speak. The healer's eyes flicked to Joan, then back to Thomas. She's barren, Alpha. The room went still. Thomas heard his own heartbeat in his ears. Too loud. Too fast. Repeat that. Joan cannot bear children. Her womb is. The healer hesitated. Cursed. Thomas surged to his feet. His chair crashed backward. Cursed? What ignorant superstition. The old laws are clear. The healer's voice was steady, but her hands shook. A bond taken while the first still lives bears no fruit. You claimed Joan as mate while Margaret's bond to you remained intact. The magic recognizes this. It will not allow. Thomas's hand shot out. He grabbed the healer by the throat and lifted her off her feet. Her words choked off. The council erupted in protest, but no one moved to stop him. They were too afraid. Thomas leaned close, his voice a snarl. If anyone repeats what you just said, I will tear out their tongue. Do you understand? The healer nodded frantically. Thomas dropped her. She collapsed, gasping. He turned to the council, his eyes wild. Meeting adjourned. Get out. They fled. All except Robert. Thomas's brother stood at the back of the hall, his arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. He waited until the last council member disappeared before speaking. You destroyed Margaret for this? Thomas rounded on him. Careful. For a barren Omega you forced into your bed? Robert stepped forward. His voice was low, controlled, but fury simmered beneath every word. Margaret was the best Luna this pack has ever seen. She held us together through famine and war. And you threw her away because the child she gave you wasn't perfect enough. The child was defective. The child was your son. Robert's control shattered. He slammed his fist against the table. And now you have nothing.
No no Luna.
No respect. The pack mourns her. They wear white for her. They don't even look at Joan. You've destroyed everything she built, and for what? Thomas moved faster than thought. He had Robert by the throat, slamming him against the stone wall hard enough to crack mortar. Robert didn't fight back. He just stared at Thomas with something worse than hatred.
Pity.
You banished the wrong wolf, Robert whispered. Thomas released him. Robert slumped against the wall, gasping. Thomas's hands shook. He clenched them into fists. You're right. I did. He called the guards. They appeared instantly. They'd been waiting outside. Escort Robert beyond the northern gates. He's exiled. If he returns, kill him. Robert's eyes widened. Thomas. Now. The guards seized Robert's arms. He didn't resist. As they dragged him toward the doors, he looked back once. Margaret loved you. She would have forgiven you anything.
But you chose cruelty.
And cruelty always returns. The doors slammed shut. Thomas stood alone in the council hall. Joan remained in her chair, silent, her hands still folded like a broken doll. Thomas looked at her. Really looked at her. She was pale.
Thin.
Her eyes were hollow. She flinched when he moved. This was his mate now. This terrified girl who couldn't give him children. Who would never command respect. Who made the pack whisper about curses and stolen bonds. Margaret's face flashed through his mind. The way she'd looked at him during the culling, blood on her lips, her laugh sharp enough to wound. You'll have nothing. He'd struck her for those words. But she'd been right. A guard burst through the doors, breathless. Alpha. The Northern Scouts have returned. Thomas turned. Report. Lights, Alpha. In the Forbidden Woods. Strange lights, silver, glowing. The prey are fleeing toward our lands. Deer, elk, even the bears are running from something. The guard's voice dropped. The scouts say the woods feel different.
Wrong.
Like something's waking up. Thomas's blood ran cold. The northern woods, where he'd thrown Margaret, where he'd left her to freeze with a dying infant. 3 months ago.
She's dead, Thomas said.
But his voice lacked conviction. The guard shifted. The lights appeared 2 months ago. They've been growing stronger. And there are tracks, Alpha, wolf tracks. Too large for a normal wolf. And beside them, smaller tracks. Human-sized. A woman's. Thomas's jaw clenched. His mind raced. If Margaret had survived, if she'd somehow kept that defective thing alive, she'd be gathering strength. Waiting. Planning. Margaret had always been patient. Strategic. She negotiated treaties that took years to bear fruit. She'd played the long game better than anyone. And he'd given her a reason to want him dead. Double the patrols, Thomas ordered. His voice was ice. Triple them. I want eyes on those woods at all times. And if they find her, Alpha? Thomas met the guard's eyes. His face was stone. If she's alive, find her. And kill her before she becomes a problem. The guard saluted and fled. Thomas stood alone again. Joan had disappeared at some point, slipped away like a ghost. He was glad. He couldn't stand to look at her. He walked to the window. Beyond the gates, the northern woods stretched dark and impenetrable. Somewhere in that darkness, something was growing. Something he'd tried to kill. Thomas's hands tightened on the windowsill until his knuckles went white. He should have made sure Margaret was dead before he closed those gates. Edward moved through the trees like smoke. 3 years old, and he was faster than wolves twice his age. Margaret watched from her perch on a fallen log as her son stalked a deer through the underbrush. His footfalls made no sound. His breathing was controlled, measured. The silver markings across his shoulders glowed faint beneath his skin, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The deer never heard him coming. Edward struck. His small body launched from cover with speed that shouldn't have been possible. He brought the deer down in seconds, his teeth finding the throat with precision Margaret had spent months teaching him. The animal jerked once, then went still. Edward stepped back, his mouth bloody, his silver eyes bright with satisfaction. "Clean kill," Margaret called. "Well done." Edward wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He was small for 3 years old, would always be small probably, given how he'd started, but his body was compact muscle now. The twisted spine was gone. The weak lungs were a distant memory. He breathed easier than Margaret did after a hunt. He ran faster. He healed from injuries in hours instead of days. 2 years in the northern woods had changed them both. Margaret's body was lean and hard, her hands calloused, her reflexes sharp. She taught herself to hunt, to fight, to survive without a pack's protection. And then she taught Edward. Everything she learned, she passed to him. Everything she suffered, she made sure he'd never have to endure unprepared. They'd built a life in these forbidden woods. A shelter that was more than bark and branches now, a real structure with walls and a fire pit and furs for warmth. Margaret had killed wolves from rival packs who'd wandered too close. She'd taken their pelts, their weapons, their supplies. Edward had watched her do it. He'd asked why she didn't let them live. Because mercy is a luxury, Margaret had told him. And we don't have luxuries. Edward dragged the deer back to their shelter. Margaret started skinning it while he watched, his eyes tracking every movement of her blade. She'd given him his own knife last month. He'd cut himself learning to use it. The wound had healed before nightfall. "Tell me the story again," Edward said. Margaret didn't ask which story. There was only one he wanted to hear. She continued working, her hands steady as she spoke. "Your grandfather's name was Edward, like yours. He was the last Silverclaw before you, born with marks on his skin and silver in his eyes. Silverclaws don't submit to alphas. They challenge them. Your grandfather challenged Thomas's father for control of the pack 30 years ago. Did he win?" Edward always asked this, even though he knew the answer. Almost. He was faster, stronger. The pack was ready to follow him. But Thomas's father cheated. He poisoned your grandfather before the final challenge. By the time they fought, your grandfather could barely stand. Thomas's father killed him in front of the entire pack. Margaret's hands paused. Thomas watched. He was young then. But he learned. He learned that Silverclaws are dangerous. That they need to be destroyed before they grow strong. Edward's markings flared brighter. "Is that why he tried to kill me?" "Yes." Margaret met his eyes. Thomas's father told him the stories. Warned him about the bloodline. When you were born with the signs, the twisted spine, the silver eyes, Thomas knew what you were. Or what you could become. So he tried to end you before you could challenge him. But I lived. You lived. Margaret's smile was cold. And now you're everything he feared. Edward stood. His markings covered his shoulders like armor now, silver lines that branched across his skin in patterns that matched the ancient carvings Margaret had found. Under moonlight, they glowed bright enough to illuminate the darkness. Under stress or anger, they pulsed like a heartbeat. Margaret had stopped being afraid of them months ago. Now she saw them for what they were. Proof that her son was meant for more than survival. He was meant for conquest. Edward had grown into his power quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. He spoke in full sentences before he was 2. He could track prey by scent alone before most pups could walk steadily. His strength was inhuman. Last week, he'd lifted a log Margaret struggled with. He'd barely strained. The northern woods had accepted them. The wrongness Margaret felt that first night had faded, replaced by something else. Recognition, maybe. The old magic that breathed here didn't fight them anymore. It watched. It waited. Sometimes Margaret heard whispers in languages she didn't know. Sometimes Edward answered them. She didn't ask what they said. Margaret finished with the deer and stood. Edward was staring toward the south, toward pack lands. He did this often. stood at the edge of the clearing and looked toward the place that had tried to kill him. Margaret knew what he was thinking. She thought it too every day. When do we go back? Edward turned. His silver eyes met hers, glowing like cold fire in the fading light. The question was written across his face even before he spoke it aloud. When do we go back? Margaret's smile was sharp as broken glass. She crossed her son and knelt, bringing herself to his eye level. She touched the markings on his shoulders, warm beneath her fingers, pulsing with power Thomas had tried to bury in snow. Soon, she whispered. Edward's eyes brightened. His markings flared. And somewhere in the distance, toward Pack lands, wolves howled their evening song. They had no idea what was coming for them. Alice appeared at dusk, stumbling through the trees like a ghost. Margaret saw her before she reached the clearing. Old instincts never died. She'd positioned herself between Alice and the shelter before the other wolf took 3 more steps. Her knife was already drawn. Margaret. Alice's voice cracked. She raised her hands, empty, trembling. Please. I come alone. Margaret didn't lower the blade. You were forbidden from helping me. I know. Alice stopped 20 feet away, her eyes desperate. I've regretted it every day since. I should have. Her voice broke. I should have done something. Anything. Margaret watched her old friend in silence. Alice had been one of the few who'd wept openly when the guards dragged Margaret through the gates. She'd worn white for months, but she hadn't followed, hadn't fought, hadn't risked Thomas's wrath to offer even the smallest mercy. Why are you here now? Margaret's voice was ice. Thomas is dying. The words hung in the air. Margaret's grip on the knife tightened, but her expression didn't change. Good. He's called a blood summit. 7 days from now. Alice stepped closer, desperate. Any wolf can challenge for the throne. Margaret, this is your chance. Come back. Claim what's yours. The pack wants you. Half of them have been waiting for this moment since the day he threw you out. Margaret tilted her head. And the other half? Terrified. Confused. But they'll follow strength. You know they will. Thomas's authority has been crumbling for years. Joan can't give him an heir. Robert is exiled. The council is fractured. If you return now, if you challenge him, Alice's eyes blazed with something fierce and hungry. You'll win. I know you will. Margaret considered this. 7 days. A blood summit meant open challenge, combat witnessed by all.
No tricks. No poison.
Just strength against strength. Thomas would be weak, dying, desperate. It should be easy. But Margaret didn't trust easy. What killed the bond? Margaret asked. Between Thomas and Joan? Alice's face darkened. The curse. The pack remembers now. Too late, but they remember. A stolen bond bears no fruit. Thomas took Joan while you still lived, while your bond to him hadn't broken. The old magic punished him for it. Joan's womb is barren. She'll never conceive. Where is Joan now? Alice hesitated. Gone. She fled 2 weeks ago. Thomas was getting violent, blaming her, threatening her. She disappeared one night. Some say she ran toward the Southern Territories. But I think she's still close. Hiding in the woods somewhere. Too afraid to go far. Too terrified to stay. Margaret processed this. Joan was a loose thread. A complication. But also a potential witness. If Joan testified about Thomas's cruelty, about the forced bond, it would destroy what little authority he had left. The pack knows I'm alive? Margaret asked. They suspect. The scouts report lights in the northern woods. Prey fleeing south. Strange sounds at night. Alice's voice dropped. Some say you've become something else. Something the woods changed. They're afraid of you, Margaret. But they also hope. Because if you survived what Thomas did, if you're still out here after 3 years, then maybe you're strong enough to end him. Margaret smiled. It was not a kind expression. I am. Alice exhaled, relief flooding her face. Then come back. 7 days. The Blood Summit. Every wolf in the territory will be there. Challenge him in front of them all. Take back your title. Take back everything he stole. I will. Margaret's voice was soft. Final. But not alone. Alice frowned. What do you mean? Movement behind Margaret. A small figure stepped from the shelter into the firelight. Edward emerged slowly, deliberately, his silver eyes fixed on Alice. He was 3 years old. He looked older. The markings on his shoulders glowed beneath his skin, silver lines that pulsed with each heartbeat. His eyes reflected the fire like mirrors, cold and bright and utterly inhuman. Alice's breath stopped. Her face went white. She took a step back, then another, her hand flying to her mouth. That's impossible. Edward said nothing. He moved to Margaret's side and stood there, watching Alice with an intensity that made the older wolf flinch. The markings on his shoulders flared brighter. The air around him seemed to shimmer. Silverclaw, Alice whispered. He's you. She looked at Margaret with something between awe and terror. The legends. Your father. I thought they were stories. They weren't. Margaret placed her hand on Edward's shoulder. His skin was warm beneath her palm, the markings pulsing against her fingers. This is Edward.
My son.
The child Thomas tried to kill. Alice stared. He was dying. The healers said. The healers didn't know what he was. Margaret's smile was sharp as broken glass. Neither did Thomas. But I did. And I've spent 3 years making sure my son becomes everything his father feared. Edward's eyes never left Alice. When he spoke, his voice was clear, controlled, far too mature for a 3-year-old. Tell the pack my mother is alive. Tell them I'm alive. Tell them we're coming. Alice trembled. Thomas will.
Thomas will die.
Margaret's voice cut through the night like a blade. She met Alice's eyes. Tell the pack the Luna is coming home. Alice nodded frantically. She backed away, her eyes still locked on Edward, unable to look away from the glowing marks, the silver eyes, the impossible child who shouldn't exist. Margaret watched her disappear into the trees. Beside her, Edward's markings pulsed brighter. He looked up at his mother. 7 days, he said. 7 days, Margaret agreed. And in the firelight, their shadows stretched long and dark, 2 figures who'd survived the impossible and were finally ready to collect what they were owed. Margaret found Joan 3 days later, curled in a cave half a mile from pack borders. The girl had tried to hide her tracks, but desperation made people careless. Margaret followed the broken branches, the disturbed moss, the faint scent of fear that clung to everything Joan touched. The cave entrance was narrow, hidden behind a curtain of dead vines. Margaret crouched outside and listened. Shallow breathing. A heartbeat too fast, too weak. The smell of hunger and unwashed skin. Joan had been here for weeks, surviving on nothing but terror and whatever scraps she could scavenge. Joan, Margaret called softly. I know you're inside. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then a small, broken voice. Please don't hurt me. Margaret's jaw tightened. She pushed through the vines and entered the cave. The space was barely large enough for 2 people. Joan was pressed against the far wall, her knees drawn to her chest, her dress torn and filthy. She'd lost weight, too much weight. Her cheekbones jutted sharp beneath pale skin. Her eyes were hollow, ringed with dark circles. She looked like she'd been dying slowly for months. Maybe she had been. I'm not here to hurt you, Margaret said. She kept her distance, crouching near the entrance. I'm here to talk. Joan's eyes were wild. Thomas sent you. Thomas doesn't know I'm alive. Joan stared. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Margaret. Her voice cracked. They said you died. They said you, and the baby froze in the culling field.
Thomas said that.
The pack hoped it. Margaret's voice was flat. I survived. So did my son. Joan's breath hitched. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she made no sound. She looked like she'd forgotten how to cry properly, like even grief had been beaten out of her.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
I didn't want, he made me. I know. Margaret cut her off. She studied Joan carefully, cataloging every bruise hidden beneath the filth, every way the girl held herself, like she expected a blow. Tell me what happened. Joan shook her head frantically. I can't. If he finds out I spoke to you, he won't. Not unless you go back. Margaret's voice gentled, just slightly.
Joan.
You're hiding in a cave, starving, too afraid to run, and too afraid to stay. This isn't living.
Talk to me.
Help me understand what Thomas did to you. Joan's resistance crumbled. The words spilled out in a rush, desperate and broken. He chose me that night, right after they dragged you away. He grabbed my wrist and said I was his mate now. I tried to refuse. I tried to say no, but he said if I didn't accept the bond, he'd exile my family. My mother, my little brother, they're all I have. So her voice broke. I let him mark me. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. She kept her voice steady. Go on. He never loved me. Never even pretended. I was just a womb. A vessel. He needed an heir, and I was supposed to give him one. Joan's laugh was hollow. But I couldn't. Month after month, nothing. The healers examined me. They said I was cursed. That taking me while your bond still lived had triggered some old law I'd never even heard of. A stolen bond bears no fruit. Thomas lost his mind. He hurt you. He blamed me, said I'd tricked him somehow, that I was barren on purpose. He'd corner me in our chambers and... Joan's voice dropped to a whisper. He'd rage, throw things,
hit me.
Once he held me against the wall by my throat and told me I was worthless, that he should have thrown me out with you. Margaret's chest burned with cold fury. Not for herself. For this terrified girl who'd been dragged into Thomas's orbit and destroyed for failing to fix his mistakes. Why didn't you tell the council? Who would believe me? Thomas is the alpha. I'm nothing. An omega. The lowest rank. Even if they believed me, they wouldn't help. Some of them think I deserve it for taking your place. Joan's eyes filled with fresh tears. I waited until he fell asleep one night, then I ran. I've been hiding ever since. I can't go back. He'll kill me this time. I know he will. Margaret was silent for a long moment. She studied Joan, really looked at her. The girl was 19, maybe 20 now. Barely older than a child. She'd been thrown into a nightmare not of her making and punished for surviving it. Margaret should hate her.
Part of her wanted to.
But Joan wasn't the enemy. She was another victim. Another piece Thomas had broken and discarded. And victims could be useful. There's a blood summit in 4 days, Margaret said. Thomas called it. Any wolf can challenge for the throne. Joan's eyes widened. You're going back? Yes. He'll kill you.
No.
Margaret's smile was cold. He won't. But I need something from you first. Joan tensed.
What?
Testimony. You're going to stand in front of the pack and tell them everything you just told me. The forced bond. The threats. The violence. The curse. All of it. I can't. Joan's voice rose in panic. Margaret, he'll do nothing. Because I'll protect you. Margaret leaned forward, her gaze intense. Joan, you're the proof the pack needs. You're the living consequence of Thomas's cruelty. If you testify, his authority shatters. The pack will turn on him. And when he falls, you'll be free. Truly free. No more running. No more hiding. I'll make sure of it. Joan stared at her, trembling. Why would you protect me? After what happened after I took your place. You didn't take anything. Thomas stole it. From both of us. Margaret's voice was hard as iron. But you can help me take it back. Stand with me at the summit.
Speak.
And I'll make sure Thomas never touches you again. Joan's eyes searched Margaret's face, looking for a lie, a trick, anything that might explain why her predecessor would offer mercy. She found only cold determination. If I do this, if I testify, what happens to Thomas? He loses everything. And then, Margaret's smile was merciless. Then he dies. Joan was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. I'll do it.
Good.
Margaret stood. Come with me. I have shelter.
Food.
You'll need your strength. Joan pushed herself upright on shaking legs. She took a step toward Margaret, then stopped. Her eyes were wide, frightened. Margaret, you said your son survived. He did. Thomas tried to kill him. A newborn. His own child. Joan's voice dropped to a whisper. What kind of monster does that? The kind that fears what he can't control. Margaret moved toward the cave entrance.
Come.
There's someone you need to meet. Joan followed her out of the cave, stumbling in the daylight. Margaret led her through the trees toward the shelter. As they walked, Joan's voice was small, uncertain. Margaret. At the summit. Who's going to challenge Thomas? You? Margaret glanced back. Her smile was sharp as broken glass.
No.
Joan frowned. Then who? They broke into the clearing. Edward stood by the fire, his silver eyes tracking their approach. His markings glowed faint beneath his skin, spiraling across his shoulders like armor. He was small, 3 years old, but the power radiating from him was undeniable. Ancient. Dangerous. Waiting. Joan stopped dead. Her hand flew to her mouth. That's impossible. Edward's eyes met hers. Cold. Assessing. When he spoke, his voice was clear and terrible in its calm. Tell the pack my father tried to kill me. Tell them I survived. Margaret placed her hand on Edward's shoulder. My son is. Margaret and Edward reached the pack gates at dawn, 3 days before the Blood Summit. Joan walked beside them, her face pale but resolute. They'd waited for this moment, planned for it. And now, with the first light breaking over the horizon, they stood at the threshold of the place that had tried to erase them. The guards saw them first. 2 young wolves Margaret didn't recognize, replacements for the older, loyal ones who'd served during her time as Luna. Their hands went to their weapons automatically, then froze. One of them took a step back, his eyes widening.
Luna?
His voice cracked on the word. Margaret didn't answer. She walked forward, Edward at her side, Joan trailing behind. The gates were closed. Massive wooden barriers reinforced with iron, designed to keep threats out. Or to keep condemned wolves from coming back. Open the gates, Margaret commanded. The guard stared. One of them found his voice. We thought you were dead. I'm not. Open the gates. We can't. Not without the Alpha's permission. Edward stepped forward. His markings flared beneath his skin, silver lines pulsing bright enough to cast light across the snow. The guards recoiled. One of them made a sound between a gasp and a prayer. What is that? The second guard whispered. My son, Margaret said. The child your Alpha tried to murder. Open the gates, or we'll open them ourselves. The first guard's hand trembled on his sword hilt. He looked at Edward, at the impossible glow of his markings, at the silver eyes that tracked every movement with inhuman precision. Then he looked at Margaret, the Luna who'd survived 3 years in Forbidden Woods, who stood before them like a blade forged in ice. He opened the gates. The sound echoed through the pack lands like thunder. Wolves emerged from their homes, drawn by the noise. They gathered in the main square, their faces confused, shocked, disbelieving. Margaret walked through the gates with her head high, Edward beside her, Joan following like a ghost. The crowd grew with every step. Someone screamed. A woman. Margaret recognized her. Sarah, one of the healers. She pushed through the crowd, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Margaret. Oh gods, Margaret, you're alive. Others took up the cry. Some wept. Some fell to their knees. Some just stared in silence, their faces pale with shock. Margaret saw Alice in the crowd, her old friend's face bright with fierce satisfaction. She saw Robert, Thomas's exiled brother, standing at the edge of the square with arms crossed and something dark and hungry in his eyes. And she saw fear. Plenty of wolves backed away when Edward moved into the light. His markings glowed brighter in the open air, silver spirals covering his shoulders, his arms, creeping up the sides of his neck. He looked like something out of legend, something that shouldn't exist. Silverclaw, someone whispered. The word spread through the crowd like wildfire. The doors to the council hall burst open. Thomas emerged flanked by guards, 6 of them, armed, tense. He'd aged in 3 years. His face was gaunt, his movements slower. The sickness Alice mentioned was visible now. He was dying, but he was still alpha, still dangerous. Thomas's eyes found Margaret first. His expression flickered, shock, rage, something that might have been fear. Then his gaze dropped to Edward.
He went white. No.
The word was barely a whisper. Thomas took a step forward, then stopped. His eyes were fixed on Edward's markings, on the silver glow that pulsed beneath the boy's skin. No, that's impossible. You were defective. Dying. Edward said nothing. He just stared at his father with eyes that burned cold and bright. Margaret stepped forward, placing herself between Thomas and her son. Not protectively, deliberately. A barrier Thomas would have to go through if he wanted to reach Edward again.
Defective, she said.
That's what you called him. Before you threw us both out to freeze. Thomas's jaw clenched. He looked at Margaret now, really looked at her. She was different. Harder. Leaner. She moved like a predator, like something that had learned to hunt and kill and survive without mercy. This wasn't the Luna he'd discarded. This was something else. You should be dead, Thomas said. So should he. Margaret gestured to Edward. But we're not. And now we're here. 3 days before your blood summit. How convenient. The crowd murmured. Thomas's eyes narrowed. You're not welcome here. The summit is open to all challengers. Margaret's voice carried across the square, pitched for every wolf to hear. Any wolf can challenge for the throne. Those are the rules you set, Thomas. The rules you're bound by. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. You have no right. I have every right. I was Luna for 10 years. You stripped my title, but you never broke our bond properly. You just threw me away and claimed another. Margaret glanced at Joan. The girl stepped forward on trembling legs. Tell them, Joan. Tell them what he did. Joan's voice was small at first, but it grew stronger with each word. Thomas forced the bond on me. He threatened my family if I refused. He needed an heir, but I couldn't give him one. The bond was cursed. A stolen bond bears no fruit. When the healers told him, her voice cracked. He hurt me, blamed me, made me wish I'd never been born. The crowd erupted. Voices rose in shock, anger, confusion. Some wolves moved toward Joan, their faces sympathetic. Others looked at Thomas with dawning horror. Thomas's face twisted with rage.
Lies.
She fled like a coward. She fled because you beat her. Margaret's voice cut through the noise like a blade.
Just like you beat me that night.
Just like you've beaten anyone who dared question you. But we're not afraid anymore, Thomas. And we're not leaving. Thomas turned to his guards. Remove them. All 3.
Now.
The guards hesitated. They looked at Margaret, at Edward's glowing marks, at the crowd that was rapidly turning against their alpha. None of them moved. I said remove them. Thomas's voice was a roar.
No.
Robert's voice rang out from the edge of the crowd. Thomas's brother pushed forward, his face carved from stone. The summit is in 3 days. Margaret has the right to be here. So does her son. That thing is not my son. That thing, Margaret said, her voice ice, is everything you feared. You knew what he was the moment he was born. Silver eyes, twisted spine, The marks of a silver claw. You knew he'd grow strong. Knew he'd challenge you. So you tried to kill him before he could become a threat. The crowd was silent now. Every eye was on Thomas. He looked trapped, cornered, his authority crumbling with every passing second. Silverclaw, he spat. Your father was the last one. My father killed him before he could poison this pack with his weakness. Weakness. Margaret's laugh was sharp. Is that what you call it? My father nearly overthrew yours. He was faster, stronger, more powerful than any alpha this pack had seen in generations. Your father had to cheat to win. Poison. Just like you'd cheat now if we gave you the chance. Thomas took a step forward. His guards moved with him, but the crowd pressed closer, a wall of bodies that made any violence impossible without consequences. You think you can challenge me? You're nothing. A discarded mate and a freak child who should have died in the snow. I'm not challenging you. Margaret's smile was cold. He is. Edward stepped forward. He was small compared to Thomas, barely reaching the alpha's waist. But his markings blazed bright as stars, and his silver eyes never wavered. When he spoke, his voice carried across the square with unnatural clarity. You tried to kill me when I was helpless, Edward said. Threw me into the snow because you were afraid of what I'd become. You were right to be afraid. Thomas stared down at his son. For a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition maybe, or regret. Then it was gone, replaced by cold fury. You're a child. The summit allows challenges, but you're not even old enough to shift properly. You'll die in seconds. Then you have nothing to fear. Edward's head tilted. Unless you're afraid I'm stronger than you think. The crowd pressed closer. Margaret could feel the tension building, could see wolves choosing sides with their eyes, their posture, their silence. Some moved toward Thomas, the old guard, the ones who'd benefited from his rule. Others moved toward Margaret, the ones who'd mourned her, who'd worn white, who'd never forgiven what he'd done. Thomas looked at Margaret, at Edward, at Joan, who stood with her head high despite the terror in her eyes, at the crowd that was no longer entirely his. His jaw worked, his hands trembled, with rage or sickness. Margaret couldn't tell. Fine, Thomas said. His voice was quiet.
Deadly.
The summit is in 3 days. Any wolf can challenge. If the boy wants to fight, let him register his challenge with the council. But know this. He leaned down, bringing his face level with Edward's. When I kill you, I'll make it slow. I'll make your mother watch. And when you're dead, I'll throw her back into those woods and make sure she doesn't survive a second time. Edward didn't flinch. His silver eyes locked onto Thomas's, unblinking, unflinching. You couldn't kill me when I was helpless, he said softly. You won't kill me now. The words hung in the air. Thomas straightened, his face white with fury. He turned and strode back toward the council hall, his guards scrambling to follow. The doors slammed shut behind him with a sound like a death knell. The crowd erupted. Wolves pressed forward, some trying to reach Margaret, others arguing among themselves. Alice appeared at Margaret's side, her eyes bright. You did it. You're back. Margaret looked at the council hall, at the closed doors, at the place where Thomas had disappeared. We're not done yet. Edward stood beside her, his markings still glowing, his small hand reaching for hers. Margaret took it. His skin was warm, pulsing with power. She was only beginning to understand. 3 days until the Blood Summit. 3 days until Edward would face the Alpha who'd tried to kill him. 3 days until Thomas learned what it meant to create your own destroyer. Margaret squeezed her son's hand. They were ready. The Blood Summit began at dawn on the 3rd day. The entire pack gathered in the ceremonial circle, a flat expanse of packed earth surrounded by ancient stones carved with symbols older than memory. Margaret stood at the edge with Joan, watching as the council called the gathering to order. Thomas emerged from the council hall, looking like death walking. His skin was gray, his movements stiff, but his eyes burned with desperate fury. He knew what was coming. He knew his reign ended today one way or another. The head elder stepped forward, her voice carrying across the circle. By ancient law, any wolf may challenge for the alpha's crown. The challenger fights until submission or death. The victor rules. Who comes forward? Robert stepped into the circle first. Thomas's brother moved with cold purpose, his jaw set. I challenge. The pack murmured. Thomas's expression didn't change. Accepted. They fought. Robert was younger, faster, fueled by years of exile and rage. But Thomas was experienced, brutal. He fought dirty, used his weight, his reach, his knowledge of Robert's weaknesses. Within minutes, Robert was on his back, Thomas's teeth at his throat. Robert submitted. Thomas released him and stood, bleeding from a gash across his ribs, but victorious. Next, Thomas snarled. A rival alpha from the Eastern Territory stepped forward. Marcus. Margaret recognized him, ambitious, ruthless, hungry for power. I challenge. The fight was longer, more vicious. Marcus was fresh. Thomas was already wounded, already exhausted. They tore at each other with claws and teeth, blood staining the packed earth. The pack watched in tense silence. For a moment, it looked like Marcus would win. He had Thomas pinned, his jaws closing toward the throat. Then Thomas twisted, impossibly fast for someone dying. His teeth found Marcus's shoulder and tore. Marcus screamed. Thomas pressed his advantage, relentless despite his injuries. Marcus submitted before Thomas could rip his throat out. Thomas stood in the center of a circle, swaying. Blood dripped from multiple wounds. His breathing was ragged, but he was still standing, still alpha. Anyone else? His voice was hoarse. The head elder looked to Margaret. There is one more matter before the final challenge. Joan stepped forward. Joan moved into the circle on shaking legs. Margaret followed, standing beside her. The pack pressed closer, sensing something momentous. Speak, the elder commanded. Joan's voice was quiet at first, then grew stronger. She told them everything. The forced bond, the threats, the violence, the curse that left her barren because Thomas had stolen her while Margaret still lived. Her words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward. The pack erupted in outrage. Some wept. Others shouted accusations at Thomas. Thomas said nothing. His face was stone. The law has been broken, the elder pronounced. A bond taken while another life bears consequences. Thomas's actions have cursed this pack. He will have no heir. His line ends. The pack's anger grew. Margaret watched Thomas's authority shatter in real time. He'd ruled through fear and tradition. Now both were gone. There is one more challenger, Margaret said. Her voice cut through the noise. The pack fell silent. My son. Edward stepped into the circle. The pack gasped. Some recoiled. Others leaned forward, hungry to see. Edward was small, just 3 years old. But his markings blazed beneath his skin, silver spirals covering his shoulders and arms. His eyes glowed like cold fire. Thomas stared at his son. For the first time, Margaret saw genuine fear in his face.
No, Thomas whispered.
He's a child. This is forbidden. The law says any wolf may challenge, the elder replied. He is your son, your blood. He has the right. Thomas looked around wildly, searching for support. He found none. The pack wanted this, needed this. They needed to see the son face the father, the rejected face the rejecter. Then come, Thomas growled. He dropped into a fighting stance, his body screaming in protest. Let's finish what I should have done 3 years ago. Edward moved. He was faster than anything Margaret had ever seen. One moment he was standing still. The next he was on Thomas, his small body a blur of silver light. Thomas tried to block, tried to counter, but Edward was everywhere at once.
Teeth. Claws.
Speed that shouldn't be possible. Thomas landed a blow. Edward rolled with it, barely slowed. He came back harder, faster. His markings flared brighter with each strike. The pack watched in stunned silence as a 3-year-old dismantled their alpha piece by piece. Thomas was bleeding.
Badly.
He swung wild, desperate. Edward ducked under the blow and struck, his small fist connecting with Thomas's knee. Something cracked. Thomas went down. Edward was on him instantly. His hand wrapped around Thomas's throat. His other hand raised, claws extended, positioned over Thomas's heart. One strike. That's all it would take. One blow, and Thomas would be dead. The pack held its breath. Edward's silver eyes found Margaret at the edge of the circle. His voice was steady, eerily calm. What do I do? The choice was hers. Kill Thomas, and his line, give the pack the revenge they craved. Or spare him, show mercy to the man who'd shown none. Margaret looked at Thomas, broken, bleeding, defeated beneath his own son. She looked at the pack, waiting for her judgment. She looked at Joan, who watched with hollow eyes. She looked at Edward, her son, the weapon she'd forged in exile. The silence stretched, waiting, infinite. Margaret held Edward's gaze across the circle. Her son's hand remained poised over Thomas's heart, claws ready to strike. The pack waited. Thomas lay beneath Edward, broken and bleeding, his eyes wide with the knowledge that his death was one word away. Margaret lifted her hand, not in a killing gesture, in a stay. Edward's eyes narrowed. Why? Because death is mercy, Margaret said. Her voice carried across the circle, cold and clear. And he doesn't deserve mercy. She walked into the circle, her steps deliberate. She stopped beside Thomas and looked down at the man who'd been her mate, her partner, her destroyer. He looked small now. Pathetic. The sickness had eaten away at him, but it was the defeat that truly hollowed him out. You tried to kill us, Margaret said softly. Threw us into the snow to freeze and die alone. You wanted us erased, forgotten, but we survived. And now you're going to watch everything you built bow to the son you rejected. Thomas's face twisted with rage and despair. Kill me. Just kill me.
No.
Margaret's smile was cold as winter. Edward, step back. Edward hesitated, then obeyed. He moved away from Thomas, his markings still glowing bright. Thomas lay on the ground, gasping, unable to rise. The head elder stepped forward. The challenge is complete. The Alpha has fallen. Edward, son of Thomas and Margaret, stands victorious. She turned to the pack. Do you accept him as Alpha? The pack roared their approval. Some voices were tentative, uncertain. Others were fierce with vindication. But the sound was unanimous. Edward was Alpha now, the youngest in history. A child with silver eyes and ancient power, ruling a pack that had tried to kill him. Margaret knelt beside Edward. The elder placed a ceremonial crown, simple, carved from bone, on the boy's head. Edward stood taller, his markings blazing. Margaret, the elder said, you are restored as Luna, not as mate, but as advisor, as the one who raised our Alpha, as the one who survived the impossible. Margaret inclined her head. She'd been Luna before. She would be Luna again. But this time, she served her son's vision, not a mate's cruelty. Joan stepped forward hesitantly. Margaret turned to her. You're free. Stay or go. The choice is yours. Joan looked at the pack, at Thomas lying broken on the ground, at Margaret who'd offered her protection when she deserved nothing. I'll stay. If you'll have me. Margaret nodded. Then stay. The elder turned to Thomas. You are exiled, stripped of title, name, and protection. You will be taken to the culling field and left as you left your mate and son. If you return, you will be killed on sight. Thomas's face went white.
No, please.
Anything but. Take him, Edward commanded. His voice was steady, absolute.
Now.
Guards dragged Thomas to his feet. He fought weakly, but his body had nothing left. They hauled him toward the gates, the same gates Margaret had been thrown through 3 years ago. The pack parted to let them pass. Some watched with satisfaction. Others looked away. Margaret and Edward stood in the center of the circle and watched Thomas disappear beyond the gates. The sound of them closing echoed across pack lands. Edward looked up at his mother. "Is it finished?" Margaret placed her hand on his shoulder. His markings pulsed warm beneath her palm.
No.
"It's just beginning."